I still remember the exact second it happened, the one moment that made the whole evening feel like it had been waiting for me without my noticing. I was crouched behind the counter of the tiny bookstore, flipping through a stack of returned novels, when she walked in. The bell above the door jingled softly, and the warmth from outside clung to her coat like a second skin. She had that way of moving that made the room seem smaller, somehow, as if the air itself leaned closer. Mid-40s, but not in a way that shouted grown-up responsibilities or life's disappointments. More like someone who had lived enough to know herself, but still carried a spark you couldn't help noticing. Her hair, streaked with early silver, caught the light like subtle threads of glass, and her eyes, those eyes, made me suddenly aware of the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I straightened up, my knees cracking from being crouched too long. "Evening, Ms. Dalton," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out tighter than I expected. She smiled, slowly, knowingly, like she already knew I'd messed this up. "Evening, Liam," she said, tilting her head in that way that made it feel like she wasn't just greeting me, but somehow noticing everything I thought I was hiding. I handed her the receipt for a book she'd returned last week. Our fingers brushed, just a quick, almost accidental touch, but her hand lingered. And then she said it. "I've always watched over you." The words were soft, and for a second, my chest forgot how to do its job. There was something in the way she said it, a quiet confession wrapped in a simple statement. Not a warning, not a threat, not a demand, just acknowledgement. And when her hand lingered against mine for that fraction of a second longer, it felt like the weight of unspoken things had been pressed gently into my palm. I wanted to say something, something clever, something that made it clear I was aware of whatever subtle line we were skirting, but instead I swallowed. My throat went dry. I watched the way her lips curved, slightly amused, almost indulgent, and felt an odd mix of admiration and hesitation. She glanced at the shelf behind me, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. I wanted to tell her she didn't have to pretend like she wasn't noticing me noticing her. But I didn't. I stayed rooted behind the counter, my hands gripping the edge like it was a lifeline, and let the silence stretch just long enough for it to feel significant. Then, as if to anchor herself in the ordinary, she reached for a book, a battered copy of The Great Gatsby. Her fingers traced the spine like she was reading it by touch. I watched, and I realized I was holding my breath, counting the seconds as if they were something I could pause, something I could hold on to. She glanced back at me one more time before moving to the register, and the electricity, the faint, almost embarrassing kind that makes your palms sweat and your brain fumble, lingered. I wasn't supposed to think about it. I wasn't supposed to want it to happen again. But already, just in that brief moment, it had. And I knew I wouldn't stop thinking about it. I found myself at the repair shop again the next Saturday, though I wasn't sure why. The smell of motor oil and rubber tires filled the air, thick and warm, the hum of machines humming like background music I hadn't realized I needed. She was there first, crouched over the hood of a dusty old car, sleeves rolled up, hands smeared with grease. She didn't look up when I stepped inside, but I caught the faint arch of her brow, the subtle shift in her posture that said, "You're here again. Need a hand?" I asked, keeping my voice casual, though my stomach did a little flip. She straightened just enough to glance at me, her expression carefully neutral. "If you can lift that engine cover without dropping it." "Yes," she said, and I could hear the faint humor underneath the guarded tone. As I crouched beside her, passing her the tool she requested, I noticed the small things, the way her hands moved with practiced precision but trembled slightly when she stretched to reach the other side of the engine, the faint dark circles beneath her eyes, the subtle slump in her shoulders that hinted she hadn't slept well. Her laugh, when a bolt refused to budge, was soft, almost apologetic, and it caught me off guard. We worked in silence for a while, the air thick with oil and unspoken thoughts. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but my eyes kept drifting to her. How she furrowed her brow when concentrating, how her lips pressed together when frustrated, how the ends of her hair fell carelessly across her face, catching the harsh fluorescent light. "Do you always do this alone?" I asked finally, voice quieter than intended, almost like I didn't want her to hear. She hesitated, the movement so slight I could have missed it if I weren't paying attention. Then she gave a half shrug, shoulders stiff. Mostly. I like knowing I can handle it. Makes things simpler. Her gaze flicked away, to the corner of the shop, to anything but me. But her hand lingered on the wrench a second too long. I passed her another tool, and our fingers brushed again. This time, longer, more deliberate, though she didn't look at me. My chest tightened, not with desire exactly, but with some strange, unnameable weight. Something fragile and urgent hovered in the space between us. She straightened, wiping a smear of grease from her cheek, and let out a soft sigh. I'm not usually good with company, she admitted, almost too quietly to hear, but I did. I noticed. And in that moment, the distance she tried to maintain softened, just a little, enough for me to see the vulnerability she so rarely allowed anyone to glimpse. We fell back into silence, working side by side, the tension neither of us addressed, but both of us felt. I caught her hand brushing against mine once more as she reached for another bolt. It wasn't enough to make anything happen, but it was enough. Enough to set a quiet charge through the air, something I couldn't stop thinking about as I left the shop that evening, smelling of oil and longing, and realizing that this gentle pull, this forbidden energy, was already becoming something I didn't know how to resist. The rain started before I even left the apartment that evening, hammering against the pavement with a relentless rhythm that made the streets shimmer with reflections. She had invited me over under the pretense of helping organize some old files in her home office. I told myself it was purely practical, but the way her hallway smelled, warm, faintly of coffee and something floral, made it impossible to focus on files. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor when I arrived, sorting through folders with a meticulous patience that somehow contrasted with the chaos of the storm outside. Her hair was pulled into a loose knot at the nape of her neck, strands falling free like they were intentionally teasing the line between casual and deliberate. I knelt beside her to reach a folder at the bottom of the stack, and our shoulders brushed. I froze, not because it hurt, but because the contact was heavier than I expected, loaded with something unspoken. I could feel her warmth, the subtle shift in her posture, the way her hand hovered just a fraction too long over the papers before moving away. I didn't think you'd come, she said, almost a whisper. Her voice trembled slightly, or maybe that was just my imagination. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I glanced at the rain-streaked window, pretending to consider the weather. But my eyes kept flicking back to her, her fingers tracing the edges of a folder as if that would steady them, her eyes darting to the floor and back, uncertain. "Do you ever regret things you didn't do?" she asked suddenly, the words soft, almost lost in the rumble of thunder. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to tread carefully, to stay just beyond the invisible line. Yet my heart lurched at the vulnerability hidden behind her controlled voice. Sometimes, I admitted quietly, careful not to add more than that. She let out a small, breathless laugh, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "I suppose we all do," she said, and for a moment the room contracted, the distance between us, the storm outside, everything else falling away. My hand twitched, wanting to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, to reach for hers, but I stopped. I stopped because it felt impossible, like acknowledging the tension would make it real. Then the phone rang. Sharp, intrusive, slicing through the fragile bubble we'd created. She sighed, frowning as she glanced at the caller ID, her ex. She hesitated, then quickly silenced it, muttering, "Not now." The spell broke. The moment dissolved into practicality. Folders shuffled, papers stacked, rain pounding. We moved side by side to the cabinet, shoulders brushing again, and I felt that same electricity, but this time mixed with restraint. Neither of us spoke about it, and yet the unsaid words hung between us like smoke. My fingers itched to close the gap, to bridge the distance that seemed both terrifying and necessary. As I turned to leave, she paused at the doorway, eyes lingering on mine just a fraction too long. I thought she might say something, an invitation, a confession, a warning, but instead, she simply nodded. The storm raged on outside, the room dim and charged, and I realized I had never wanted something and feared it more at the same time. I stepped into the night, rain soaking my jacket, and the memory of her hand brushing against mine stayed with me. The almost, the could have been, the hesitation that burned longer than the thunder. We sat across from each other in her kitchen, the single lamp over the table casting long shadows that made the room feel smaller than it was. Outside, the city moved on without us, cars humming past, indifferent. I could smell the faint aroma of something she'd been cooking, onions, garlic, maybe just the faint memory of coffee, and it seemed almost cruel, ordinary, against the tension thickening the air between us. She didn't say anything at first, just stirred her tea, slow, deliberate, like she was counting seconds she didn't want to give to me, or maybe herself. I wanted to speak, wanted to break the silence, but the words lodged in my throat, heavy with all the things we weren't supposed to name. Finally, she looked up, eyes catching mine in a way that made me want to both look away and stay fixed in place. "Liam," she began, voice soft, hesitant. I could tell she had rehearsed this sentence 100 times, even if only in her own head. "Do you ever wonder what the hell we're doing?" The question landed like a stone in my chest. I opened my mouth, closed it, tried again. Yeah, I admitted, voice barely audible. "All the time." Her fingers tapped on the rim of her cup, slow, nervous, almost imperceptible. She didn't meet my eyes anymore, staring instead at the steam curling above the tea. It's like we keep circling each other, pretending none of it matters. But it does, doesn't it? It did. Everything about her presence, her hand brushing mine earlier that night, the small sighs when she thought I wasn't watching, the way her eyes softened and hardened at the same time, made my chest ache. And yet I couldn't reach for her, couldn't cross that line we'd been dancing around for weeks. I don't know," I whispered, my hands tightening on the edge of the table. I can't stop thinking about it. About you. About us. But I don't know what it even is." She laughed, short, sharp, humorless, and it sounded more like a release than amusement. "Yeah, me neither." Her shoulders sagged just slightly, a crack in the armor she usually carried with effortless grace. "It's exhausting, isn't it? Trying to act like this is normal, like we're just friends." I swallowed, nodding without thinking. The silence returned, heavier now, thicker, charged with the things we weren't saying. The clock ticked on, loud in the quiet. I noticed the faint lines around her eyes, the way her lips pressed together when she tried to hold back something. Anger, fear, longing. Something sharp and raw. I wanted to reach across the table, to touch her hand, to fix all the confusion and the ache. But I stayed still, because some lines, once crossed, couldn't be undone. And in that stillness, I felt everything and nothing at the same time. Then, just when the quiet seemed unbearable, she whispered, almost to herself, almost to me, almost too low for anyone else to hear. "I don't think I can do this without hurting someone." Her words hit me like glass breaking in slow motion, leaving fragments everywhere, cutting me, yet drawing me closer at the same time. And in that moment, I realized the gravity of everything we'd been avoiding, and how impossibly, devastatingly inevitable it felt. The next afternoon, I found her sitting on the worn couch in her living room, a stack of old photographs spread across the coffee table. The rain from the previous night had left everything damp and quiet, and the smell of damp books and wax polish hung faintly in the air. She looked smaller somehow, hunched over the images as if they weighed more than the furniture around her. I didn't speak at first. I didn't want to break the fragile bubble she had created with herself. Finally, she lifted a photograph, a faded picture of a younger version of herself, smiling with someone I didn't recognize. Her thumb traced the edge of the photo, slow and deliberate, and her lips trembled just slightly. "He was everything," she murmured, voice low, almost swallowed by the quiet room. "I lost him, and I never really got over it." The words settled around us like dust, impossible to ignore. I didn't reach for her, didn't even move closer, but I felt the weight of it, pressing against my chest. I wanted to say something, anything, But the truth is, I didn't know what to say. Some hurts weren't meant for words. I knelt beside the couch, close enough that she might notice, but far enough to respect the space she needed. I, I remember you telling me about him once, I said slowly, careful, almost scared of stirring the wrong memory. You mentioned how he used to read in this exact spot. You said it made you feel safe. Her eyes flicked to me, and for a moment, the usual guard softened. Yeah, she said, a tiny laugh escaping, brittle and hollow. Safe and young. Foolish, maybe. I don't know. But he was the kind of person who made the world seem lighter, even when everything else was heavy. I swallowed, trying to ground myself. There was a shift in her tone, something I hadn't noticed before. Vulnerable, yes, but also painfully honest, unshielded. Do you ever wish you could go back? I asked, almost afraid of my own words. She shook her head slowly. No, I wouldn't. Not really. But I carry it. Every day, a little bit. And sometimes, her voice trailed off. Her hand brushed against a small envelope tucked between the photos. She picked it up, unfolding the yellowed paper inside. Sometimes I just need to touch it. Remember what it felt like before it all ended. I didn't move. I just watched, noticing how her fingers lingered on the edges of the letter, how her lips pressed together to keep from speaking, how her shoulders slumped like she was carrying all those years in a single breath. Then, without warning, she looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the weight she carried in full, the grief that had shaped her and the tenderness she still carried beneath it. Her hand brushed mine as she passed me a photo, a flicker of instinct and trust and emotion that said more than words ever could. I caught it, holding it carefully, and felt a seismic shift in something deep inside me. Not because of what the photo was, or the words she had said, but because she had let me in, just a little, and in that moment, the slow, impossible tension between us became sharper, more fragile, and utterly impossible to ignore. And as I left her apartment later, the photo still warm in my pocket, I realized that nothing would ever feel the same again. I didn't see her that weekend. Not at the shop, not at the bookstore, not in my dreams, though she lingered there anyway, faint as smoke. I kept busy, tried to tell myself it was just habit, just familiarity, but the truth was quieter, sharper, and impossible to ignore. When I finally saw her again, it was late evening. The street lamps glowed through the haze of early winter fog, and the world outside felt muted, as if it had waited for us alone. She was in the corner of the small cafe, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea, eyes fixed on the window. She didn't look up when I approached, and that alone told me more than words ever could. Hey, I said softly, letting the word hang between us, light but deliberate. She glanced up then, a small, tired smile that didn't hide everything, but didn't need to. We didn't rush to speak. We didn't even order anything. We just sat across from each other, the warmth from the tea and the cafe lamps spilling over us like an unspoken shield. Her hand rested near mine on the table, fingers twitching slightly, as if testing the distance. I shifted closer without thinking, until the gap between us was small enough that our knees brushed. I thought, she said finally, voice low, that maybe we were just fooling ourselves, pretending this wasn't complicated. She let the words trail off, eyes flicking to mine, searching. I didn't answer immediately. I just reached for her hand, careful, tentative, letting our fingers meet in that quiet, natural alignment that didn't demand declarations or promises. Just warmth, just presence. It is complicated, I admitted finally, voice barely above a whisper. But maybe some things are worth it anyway. Her thumb brushed along my knuckles, slow, deliberate, grounding both of us in the reality of the moment. She didn't say anything, but her gaze softened, and that was enough. The weight of weeks, months, unspoken words, and silent electricity seemed to fold into that single contact. We leaned back in our chairs, letting the world continue without us. Steam rose from the tea, curling lazily into the air. She tilted her head slightly, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. I watched, feeling the quiet inevitability of it all, the understanding that had built between us, earned and slow, like the turning of seasons. No grand confessions, no promises shouted into the night. Just that small, shared space where we could breathe without pretense, where our history, our vulnerabilities, and our unspoken desires settled into a rhythm that felt right. Her hand tightened around mine ever so slightly. I didn't pull away. I didn't need to. It was enough. It was everything. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the quiet finality of something real, something that had been slowly, impossibly, quietly collapsing into place. I still think about that evening often, even now. Not in a way that aches or haunts, but in the soft, lingering way that only certain moments can. Sitting there in the cafe, our hands brushing, our quiet breaths syncing with the muted world around us. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, but it was everything. I've learned that love doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it grows in the spaces between conversation, in shared silences, in small gestures that mean far more than any grand declaration. And with her, I realized that the slow burn, the careful navigation of boundaries and vulnerabilities, was its own kind of intimacy. She's changed too, though in ways less visible. She's allowed herself to trust again, to feel something that she thought had passed her by. There's still a quiet weight in her eyes, the kind that carries past heartbreak and wisdom, but now it coexists with a softness she hasn't shown me, or anyone before. That blend of strength and openness is what drew me in, what keeps me grounded when the rest of the world feels uncertain. For me, I've learned patience, the power of noticing the small things. How a hand brushing against yours can carry more meaning than 1,000 words. How a glance, held just a fraction too long, can reshape a day, a memory, a heart. I've learned that longing doesn't always need to be fulfilled in dramatic ways. Sometimes it's enough that it exists, quietly, persistently, a living pulse between two people. We didn't rush. We didn't need to. The inevitability of us wasn't in gestures or promises, but in shared understanding, in mutual respect for the fragility of what had blossomed. Every touch, every silence, every glance became a language all our own, and through it, we found a kind of love that isn't about possession or urgency. It's about presence. Looking back, I realize how much has changed in me. I see her differently now, not just as someone who captivated me, but as someone who mirrored the parts of myself I hadn't fully recognized. The quiet longing, the careful restraint, the desire for connection that's patient, earned, and profound. And maybe that's what love really is, the willingness to grow alongside someone, to hold space for them and yourself, and to trust that some things are meant to unfold in their own time. We don't need grand finales. Our story didn't end with fireworks or declarations. It ended in a look, a touch, a shared cup of tea that said, without words, we're here, and this is enough. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?